In our discussion with Dr. Jeremy Sherman about his book, Neither Ghost Nor Machine, we tried to explain what the self was, which in his book is defined as every living being that ever existed or ever will exist, here or elsewhere, from its conception to its death, is a self. After we defined the self, we talked about what made self a self. So we talked about how the term self, individuals, organisms, and creatures, and agents were all used to describe living things, but we don't know what they actually mean. We also talked about how the natural world, with its physics and chemistry, doesn't actually explain what the self is or how it became a thing. One example we talked about is how natural selection and evolution are used to explain how living things came about, but in actuality, evolution doesn't explain origin. So in this case, the self can't be determined from the phenomena of evolution or the physics and chemistry that scientists like to explain the self. As Jeremy explained, natural selection keeps populations going and thriving, but it doesn't explain how. Another word that Jeremy brought up was purpose, which in his book is defined as deliberate and conscious, intended or declared goal setting, which includes all traits and behaviors that are functional, valuable, significant, or useful, including all biologically adapted traits. So, in other words, he defined purpose as an aim. And one of the aims we talked about was self-regeneration, which is an organism's goal of maintaining its own existence and reproducing offspring in order to continue their species. Jeremy also brought up the idea that this self-regeneration is actually a form of selfishness that the self evokes. He said that selves are selfish, that they are self-serving. One of the final thoughts that Jeremy brought up was the fact that we are self-programmed to behave and think the way we do, but we don't know why or how. In our discussion with Jeremy, we talked about the human self and not organismal self as a whole. But by Jeremy's definition of a self and purpose, we can say that all organisms have a self. That because they have the goal of reproducing and self-regeneration, that they do have a self and are selfish in that way. It's interesting to think of animals as having a self, because in some cases, we think an animal can think and understand us, but in other cases, we see them as just a living thing with no opinion of anything. Like for instance, house cats, we think they can understand what we're saying and feeling, but with a worm, we just assume that they're there, that they're not behaving in a certain way because they want to, but because they are biologically programmed to. So because Jeremy's definition of a self would relate to both cats and worms, hard to make a clear distinction of what I actually think these organisms are capable of. Although the idea that all organisms have a self and are selfish is not a new concept, the way we talked about the self and purpose with Jeremy really went and furthered the thought process of it all. One thing I took from the discussion is how as selves and as people, we're programmed to think and behave in certain ways that are beneficial to us. And we may think we know why we do it, but in actuality, we don't have a clear understanding of how and why we behave the way we do.